I carried her for 9 months, and now she wants to declare me insane just to steal my home and erase my name. One day she brought a lawyer, placed a paper in front of me. No name, no truth, just a plan to bury me alive with my own signature. If you think this is just another family story, you're dead wrong. Hit subscribe now, and don't miss a single twist in the shocking stories we bring you. I always told myself I would die in a library. Not dramatically, of course, no toppling from a ladder with an ancient atlas in hand. No tragic clutching of the heart while cataloging forgotten tomes. Just a quiet fade among books surrounded by the stories I loved and the silence I revered. But life had its own plot twist. The morning of the accident was uneventful. Newport was unusually warm for October. The air had that false sense of peace. Sunlight breaking through thin clouds, the street sleepy and calm. I had gone out early as always for bread, and the local paper driving the same 3-mile route I'd driven for over 40 years. At 74, muscle memory does most of the work. You trust the familiarity of things, until a delivery van swerved through a stop sign and changed the script. It wasn't violent, not in the way people expect crashes to be. No glass shattering like in the movies, no car flipping, no screaming, just a deafening jolt. The van slammed into my side of the car with enough force to spin me toward the sidewalk. I remember a sharp pain in my shoulder, then silence. Then the sound of voices I didn't recognize. Someone tapping on the window. "Ma'am, are you okay? Stay with me." I stayed. The hospital smelled of antiseptic and overcooked green beans. I stayed there for 3 days, mostly for observation. Minor concussion, a fractured clavicle, a few bruised ribs. At my age, every fall is a potential goodbye, so they kept me longer than necessary. The nurses were kind, too kind. They called me sweetheart and dear like I'd forgotten my name. They gave me pudding. I hate pudding. By the afternoon of day 2, I asked to go home. Politely, then firmly. Then I stopped being polite. I wanted my chair, my bed, my cats, my silence. But they said I needed someone to sign the discharge paperwork. A family member if possible. I don't have many of those left. Frank, my husband, passed 15 years ago. My sister Julia lives somewhere in Arizona, though we haven't spoken in 6 years. And my daughter Alexis. We hadn't shared a room since her father's funeral. But on the 3rd morning she appeared. She walked into the hospital room with a briskness that didn't match her heels. Alexis was always tall, but the years had elongated her somehow, her presence arriving 3 seconds before her voice. She wore beige, the kind of beige that said, "I do well." A tailored coat, oversized sunglasses perched on her head, and a handbag that could have paid for someone's rent. Behind her trailed a man I'd never seen before. Slim with thinning hair and a portfolio under one arm. He looked like a tax form, sterile, pale, and strangely threatening. Mother, Alexis said like we'd spoken yesterday. I stared at her from the bed, the white sheets tucked too tightly around my legs. I felt smaller than I remembered. "Alexis," I replied quietly, "you're here." "Of course I'm here," she said, placing her handbag on the chair beside her without looking. "You were in an accident." "Nothing serious." "That's not what the doctor said." Her voice carried a tone she reserved for professionals and bank clerks, people she thought she had to impress or manipulate. She pulled up a chair and crossed her legs. The man remained standing. "This is Mr. Hartwell," she gestured. "An attorney. He's helping me sort a few arrangements." I blinked. Arrangements. Alexis smiled, but her eyes didn't. "Mom, it's been a long time, and I know we haven't always agreed on everything, but I think it's time we faced facts." My left shoulder throbbed in quiet warning. "What facts?" "You're 74. You just got into a car accident. Alone. You live in a house with stairs, you don't have regular help, and let's be honest, you haven't exactly kept up with technology or medical checkups." I stared at her. "You haven't seen me in 5 years." "I know, and I'm sorry for that, but we can't change the past. We can only be responsible now." Mr. Hartwell opened his leather folder. Something inside clicked. "We've been speaking with the hospital social worker." Alexis continued, her tone softer now. "She raised some concerns. They said you seemed confused at times, forgetful. You asked the same nurse for Tylenol 3 times in a row. I narrowed my eyes. I had a headache. They were worried. You mean you were looking for a reason? Her face hardened just for a flash. That's not fair. What do you want, Alexis? The lawyer cleared his throat.
Mrs. Hargrove, may I call you Mirna?
No, he faltered. Alexis glanced at him and then back at me. He's helping with a temporary guardianship, just until we make sure you're okay. I let that sentence sink in. It hung in the room like mildew. You're trying to take control of my life,
I said, my voice low. You think because I bumped my head and broke a bone that I can't make my own decisions?
No, not at all, Alexis said quickly. We just want to help, to make sure you don't make what mistakes. She hesitated. You think I'm losing my mind? I think you're vulnerable. No, I said, you think I'm alone, and that makes me available. There it was. The truth. It slipped out of my mouth like something ancient and true. She blinked, her jaw tensing. That's not what this is. Isn't it? I looked at her. Really looked at her. There was a time she ran barefoot through our house with a flashlight and a paperback pretending to be Nancy Drew. A time she cried when a bird hit our window. A time she kissed me goodnight without resentment. But that time was gone. Now she was someone else, someone efficient, someone with a plan. I looked over at the lawyer. He had placed a pen gently on the folder. Papers peeked out. A line highlighted in yellow: authorization of guardianship in medical emergencies. I reached forward, slow and deliberate, and closed the folder without breaking eye contact. Not yet, I said. Alexis stood. The chair scraped against the tile floor like a warning. You need to consider what's best for everyone, she said. I am. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. This isn't about control, Mom. It's about protecting your legacy, your house, your things. If something happens to you and there's no plan, it all gets messy. You know how probate works. I gave a soft laugh. I worked in a library for 40 years, Alexis. I've read about every kind of betrayal there is. The legal ones, they're always the neatest. She didn't flinch. The lawyer adjusted his tie. Think about it, Alexis said. I'll come back tomorrow. I watched them leave. The beige of her coat disappearing around the doorframe, the sound of her heels echoing down the hallway. A nurse came in to check my IV. I didn't need it, but she fiddled with it anyway. You doing okay, sweetheart? She asked. I didn't answer. Outside the hospital window, the clouds were shifting. The sun tried to break through again. I thought about my cats, Poe and Elliot. They were probably curled up on the couch, wondering why breakfast hadn't come. I thought about the smell of my porch in the mornings, the way the stairs creaked differently in winter. And I thought about Alexis, the way she always looked at something before she took it. The papers hadn't been signed, not yet, and I had no intention of ever picking up that pen, because some stories aren't meant to be rewritten, and some pages were never meant to be handed over. Coming home should have felt like comfort. But that morning, as the taxi turned down Ashwood Lane and the familiar line of gnarled elms came into view, something tightened inside me. A feeling, not pain, not fear, just a quiet, bone-deep alertness, the kind of stillness that comes right before a thunderstorm. The house stood at the corner of Ashwood and Pelham, its white siding a little more tired than I remembered, the shutters slightly askew. I'd lived there since 1975. It had survived termites, 3 hurricanes, 1 kitchen fire, and the slow, uneven erosion of time. What it hadn't faced until now was invasion. The taxi stopped at the curb. The driver didn't help with the bags, just opened the trunk and went back to scrolling his phone. I hoisted the overnight case with my good arm and stepped onto the front path. The breeze smelled like damp earth and brittle leaves. October in Newport. The mailbox sat at the edge of the path, crooked on its rusted post. I paused, noticing something strange. Its door hung loose, tilted, the hinge cracked. My heart skipped once. I opened it. Inside, the week's mail had been rifled through. Letters half opened. Envelopes torn. A circular from the pharmacy looked like it had been crumpled and smoothed out again. I sifted through with trembling fingers. The only thing untouched was a crisp white envelope addressed to me in a hand I didn't recognize. I didn't open it, not yet. The front door took 2 tries with the key. As it swung open, the familiar scent hit me. Lavender potpourri, old books, and the faint musk of closed rooms. I stepped into the hallway and shut the door behind me. Silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel empty but observed. The cats didn't greet me. That was unusual. Poe usually cried at the door until I picked him up, and Elliot lurked in the kitchen waiting to pounce. But the house was still. Then I saw them huddled in the corner of the living room under the bookshelf, eyes wide. Poe hissed when I approached. That's when I knew something had happened while I was gone. I placed my bag on the entry bench and went into the kitchen. On the counter, my pill organizer sat open. Monday through Friday emptied, but I hadn't touched it in over a week. I picked up a pill, tiny, white, unfamiliar. Wrong. I reached for the magnifying glass in the drawer and held one up to the light. Not the right dosage, not even the right shape. These weren't mine. I felt it then, sharp and swift, the jolt of clarity that comes when paranoia is no longer paranoia. Someone had been in my house. I opened the fridge. Items were rearranged. Not missing, just moved. My soup jars placed where the milk should have been. An open pack of butter torn the wrong way. My apples were gone. I turned on my heel, went to the bedroom. Drawers had been opened, not rummaged violently, but examined. A few shirts folded differently, the sock drawer half open, and my desk. My desk had been wiped clean. The top drawer was locked. I pulled the key from the chain around my neck and opened it. My passbook savings log gone. Gone. I went cold. Not angry, not panicked, just cold. That drawer had held my savings log since Frank passed away. I checked the rest of the drawer, tax returns, property deeds, photocopies, all untouched. Only the passbook was missing. I moved to the desk chair, sat down slowly, and opened my laptop. It took forever to load. The battery had been run down. Someone had used it. When it finally powered up, I clicked through to my bank's website. Username, password, security questions. And then the numbers appeared. My hand flew to my mouth. 2 withdrawals, one for $4,500 and another for $7,200. Both made within the last 5 days. Both labeled online transfer, external account. I didn't recognize the destination. I stared at the screen, a slow, cold fury crawling up my spine. My fingers hovered trembling as I opened the email inbox. Nothing there. Then I clicked into the trash folder. 10 emails, all from the bank, all deleted. I clicked one open. Transfer confirmation. $7,200 sent to XTR Holdings. I clicked the next, and then I said it aloud like it needed to be spoken to be real. Someone is trying to take my life from me. I closed the laptop and stared out the kitchen window. My reflection stared back, thin and weary. That was when I saw the movement across the hedge. Next door, behind the curtain of his second-story window, Omar was watching me. Omar Jensen had lived in the house beside mine since his mother died 3 years ago. He was in his 20s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with a pale owl-like stillness. His routines were clockwork walks, at dawn headphones always in stacks of computer hardware arriving in brown boxes every Tuesday. He rarely spoke, but he waved, and he noticed. One winter evening after my heater had broken, I found a small space heater on my porch. No note. I had known it was him. Today he was there, just a figure behind a thin white curtain. I moved to the back door, stepped outside, and stood at the property line. Omar, I called. A moment passed, then he appeared. His movements were precise, not slow, but considered. He walked down the steps of his porch, eyes not quite meeting mine, hands in his hoodie pocket. "Hi," he said. His voice was soft, scratchy, like an unused tape. "I need help," I said. His eyes flicked up, met mine for a split second, then dropped again. "My computer," I added. "Someone was on it. Someone took money from my account." He nodded once. "I can check." We walked back into the house in silence. I noticed the way he scanned everything, not with suspicion, but with detail. He saw the same things I had: the open drawer, the unplugged lamp, the battery indicator on the laptop screen. In the kitchen, I made tea while he sat at the desk, his fingers dancing across keys faster than mine ever could. Lines of code filled the screen, browser history files, traces of IP addresses. After a few minutes, he looked up. "Someone logged in on Thursday. From a device that isn't yours. A remote login." My stomach turned. "Can you trace it?" He nodded. "It was a phone," he said. "Samsung, new model, GPS points to downtown Newport." "Could it be my daughter?" I asked. Omar paused, not judging, just calculating. "Do you want me to find out?" I hesitated, then I said yes. He returned to typing. While he worked, I sat on the edge of the sofa and watched Poe curl up near his feet. The house had stopped feeling like mine. Omar's voice broke the silence. "Your savings account was transferred to XTR Holdings," he said. "They're not a bank. It's a shell company." I stared at him. Shell company? A fake business. Used to hold money. I can't say for sure who owns it, but he turned the screen toward me. A name was listed next to a contact record in a metadata file. Alexis Hargrove. My breath stopped. I took the screen in my hands. The name burned through me. She did this. Omar didn't respond. I sat there, the steam from the tea fogging my glasses. My ribs ached. My shoulder throbbed. But the pain that lived in my chest was something older, deeper. "She came to the hospital," I said. "Said she wanted to help. Said I was vulnerable." Omar waited. The silence between us was respectful, not awkward. "Can you back all this up?" I asked. "Yes. Make copies of everything." He nodded. As he worked, I pulled the white envelope from my coat pocket, the one from the mailbox. I opened it. Inside was a typed letter.
No signature, just 3 lines.
"Your daughter is moving fast. You need to be faster. They'll have you locked away before the leaves turn. Don't trust anyone who brings you tea without asking how you take it." My hands shook. "Someone knows," I whispered. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel alone. There are people who talk with their hands, and then there are those who speak with silence. Omar and I didn't share conversations. We shared pages. The morning after he uncovered Alexis's connection to the transfers, I made a decision. I cleaned off the round table in the sunroom, placed a fresh notepad in the center, 2 pens, one blue, one black, and set the kettle to boil. When Omar arrived unannounced, but always precisely at 9:03, I simply opened the back door and nodded toward the sunroom. We sat facing each other, the window open just slightly, letting in the crisp October air. He didn't say anything. He rarely did unless it was necessary. Instead, he pulled the pen toward him and scribbled something on the first page. "Are you scared?" I read it, looked at him, then picked up the black pen. "No, but I'm aware now that's worse." He nodded once, understood. That morning became a ritual. Tea, a notepad, the sounds of leaves brushing the window. 2 people who'd never been close becoming allies in the quietest way possible. We weren't just neighbors anymore. We were in a war together. Omar's process fascinated me. He treated each digital footprint like an artifact. He asked for permission before touching my devices, and when I offered him my laptop, he slipped on a pair of thin black gloves, not out of necessity, but out of reverence, like a surgeon respecting his tools. By the second day, he brought his own equipment, a slim silver laptop adorned with strange stickers, a portable external hard drive the size of a passport, and a USB that lit up green when active. He carried them in a battered messenger bag that looked like it had survived a different war. I cleared the dining table for him. He worked fast, his eyes scanning code lines, logs, things I could barely follow. But he would pause now and then to write something on our notepad, a small update, a discovery. The IP that accessed your bank account bounced through 4 locations. VPN use deals traced to commercial server, rerouted. I wrote beneath it, "Too advanced for casual theft." He nodded. Scribbled again, intentional, deliberate. "They're hiding." By late afternoon, he stopped typing. I could tell something had shifted. His back straightened. His breathing changed. He turned the laptop to face me. On the screen was a simple transaction log, but this one didn't belong to my account. He had dug deeper into the receiving end of one of the external transfers. The funds had been rerouted through a shell corporation, just as we suspected, but that corporation had one registered mailing address, a place called Harbor Pines Residential Care. I stared at it. Residential care was a euphemism. I'd seen those words 1,000 times during my years organizing local tax and zoning records. It was code for nursing home, often the kind that catered to no family, no oversight, no questions. I pointed to the name and wrote slowly, "Do you know it?" Omar paused, then typed into his browser. The website loaded. A smiling elderly couple. A photo of a garden. Phrases like personalized care and dignity-first environment. Beneath the smiles, something darker lurked. The site had no staff listed, no licensing board information. The testimonials all had the same writing style. The photo metadata had been stripped. He wrote fake faces, stock photos, no license ID listed. I nodded, too clean. Then he opened a new tab and did something I hadn't expected. He visited a legal database, typed the name Harbor Pines into the search field, selected court records, waited. A list appeared. 9 legal disputes,
2 class action lawsuits, 3 patient injury reports, 1 open investigation from 2021 for unauthorized hold of patients pending payment from state.
I drew in a breath. He underlined that line with his pen. Then he turned to me, face unreadable. Wrote, "They keep people." I stared at the words. Keep, not house, not care for. Keep. I walked to the hallway and opened the cabinet where I kept my old files. Birth certificates, Frank's will, and my teaching retirement documents. Somewhere near the bottom, I found a manila folder labeled Long-Term Care Local Research. 10 years ago, after Frank passed, Alexis had begun pressuring me about planning ahead. She sent me brochures, websites, said that loneliness was dangerous. I'd researched every facility she sent me. Harbor Pines wasn't one of them. I sat back down and pushed the file across the table. Omar flipped through it silently.
At the back he paused, pulled out a sticky note, old and curling at the edges. Alexis's handwriting unmistakable. It read,
HP, ask about early
placement options. A state lawyer says early signatures help.
I hadn't remembered that note until that moment. I hadn't known what HP meant back then. Now it screamed from the paper. Alexis had been planning this longer than I thought. Omar slid the note back and looked at me. I could see it in his eyes. She wasn't just reacting to an accident. She had been waiting for an opening. I wrote on the pad, "Do you think they're trying to send me there?" He replied, "Or say you're already there." I didn't speak. I just sat there letting the reality settle around me like a fog creeping through old floorboards. That night I couldn't sleep. The cats curled close,
Elliot on my feet, Poe by my shoulder. But the weight in my chest wouldn't ease.
I kept picturing the place. Harbor Pines, the fake smiles, the shell accounts, the lawsuits, the names of the elderly held longer than legal, without contact, without court orders. And I kept hearing Alexis's voice from the hospital. "It's about protecting your legacy." A line so rehearsed it could have come from a lawyer's playbook. At 2 a.m, I got out of bed and went to the sunroom. The notebook was still there, our writing frozen in conversation. I flipped back a few pages, rereading Omar's words. "Do you want me to find out? I can check. They're hiding." And then my own sentence in sharp, determined script. "I'm aware now." The next morning, Omar arrived as expected, but with something new, a small hard case. He opened it at the dining table, revealing a compact recording setup. 2 mics, a tablet preloaded with screen capture software, and a tiny black device that looked like a USB stick but wasn't. He wrote for backup, in case we need to prove this. I smiled weakly, wrote back, "You think they'll try again?" He didn't answer directly, just placed the mic on the table and plugged in the recorder. He was building a case, for me, for us, for truth. We dove deeper. Omar traced the money, from my account to XTR Holdings, then from XTR to a second holding firm, Elmbrook Services, a company registered in Delaware under a P.O. box. But Elmbrook, he discovered, had ties to Harbor Pines. Their registered agent was the same attorney who handled state filings for the care facility. He showed me the corporate flowchart he'd built. On a screen, it looked like a spider web. Thin lines connecting company names, payment processors, billing systems, fake vendor codes. At the bottom of the diagram was my name, and a red line connecting me to a contract I'd never seen. I leaned forward, studying the screen. At the top of the form, barely legible, was the header Harbor Pines Early Intake Authorization. Underneath, in printed text, "The undersigned hereby authorizes pre-admittance planning for long-term care services, including the assignment of estate representatives upon medical verification of diminished capacity." At the bottom was a digital signature. My name, not my signature. I touched the screen, tracing the forged name with my fingertip. "I never signed this." Omar nodded. He clicked into the metadata. Time-stamped 3 weeks ago. IP traced to a device registered to Alexis's employer, an architecture firm in Providence. I laughed short and bitter. She used her work computer to forge me. He nodded again, then wrote, "It's enough." Enough for what? Enough to go to the police, enough to sue, enough to stop her. I didn't know, but it was more than I had yesterday. That afternoon we returned to the sunroom. I passed him the notebook again. He wrote, "What next?" I stared out the window. The trees were turning now gold and red and violent orange. The wind lifted the edges of the leaves like pages waiting to be turned. I wrote, "We get closer." He waited. I wrote again. "We make her believe she's winning." He didn't smile, but something shifted behind his eyes, a spark of understanding, strategy. I reached out and turned to a new page in the notebook. The war had begun. We just hadn't told her yet. The invitation was my idea. A simple dinner. Nothing fancy. Just roast chicken, green beans, and the pie Alexis used to love when she was 8. I called her that morning, voice measured and low, told her I missed our connection and wanted to talk like family again. I used all the right words: warmth, tradition, closure. She said yes too quickly. By 6:30 she was at my door alone this time. No lawyer, no coat too beige for sincerity. Just a bottle of red wine and a smile too symmetrical to be real. "Mom," she said, kissing the air near my cheek, "it smells like 1989 in here." "Dinner's almost ready," I replied. We sat in the dining room, the one that hadn't seen company since Frank's wake. The candles flickered. I wore the blue cardigan she always said made me look soft. Everything was carefully curated like a stage set. I wanted her to feel at ease, to let her guard down, to play her part without knowing she'd walked into mine. She spoke first. "So, how are you feeling?" I looked down at my plate, sliced the chicken breast neatly. "Better," I said. "That's good." She sipped her wine. "You scared me, Mom. The accident, the hospital. I'm more durable than I look." She laughed light and forced, then leaned in, fork poised like a needle. "You don't remember calling me from the hospital, do you?" I paused. "I didn't call you." "You did," she said gently. "You were confused. You told me you didn't know where you were, that you couldn't find your shoes. You asked if Dad was picking you up." I stared at her. "That never happened." "It's okay," she said. "I'm not judging. It was a stressful time." "You made that up." "Mom." She softened her voice like a nurse speaking to a restless patient. "I've been reading a lot about early-stage memory decline. It's more common than we think. The little things, misplacing items, repeating stories, confusing names, it starts subtly." I put my fork down. "Have you ever considered that I'm not the one forgetting? That maybe you're the one inventing things to fit a plan?" Her face didn't move, but her hands twitched, a tremor in the wine glass. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "Of course not," I smiled. "You're here to finish the job." "Mom, I just want what's best for you." I leaned forward. "No, you want what's left of me." The silence that followed was deeper than the one that had lived in this house for the last decade. Alexis broke it with a sigh and reached into her bag. "I didn't want to bring this tonight," she said, unfolding a sheet of paper. "But the lawyer said it should be signed before the end of the month. It'll make the transition easier should anything happen." She slid it across the table. A new document. Different header this time. Durable power of attorney, estate and health proxy. She'd streamlined it. A single signature, one witness line already filled in, probably forged. I picked it up slowly, held it like it might burn me. "I already told you, I'm not signing anything." Her face stayed still, but her eyes were ravenous. "Just think about it," she said. "This isn't about taking anything away. It's about protecting you." "From whom?" She didn't answer. We ate in silence after that. Her bites were smaller, my hands steadier. When dessert came, pecan pie overbaked on purpose, she refused a second helping. "You used to love this," I said. "Too sweet," she murmured. "So were you once." She left before 9. No hug. Just that half-hearted cheek air kiss again. I watched her get into her car from the kitchen window, the red tail lights like coals in the driveway. I didn't go back to the dining room right away. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked into the sunroom, sat at the writing table. The power of attorney document lay on the chair right where I'd hidden it after she excused herself to the bathroom. She'd left a fake one on the table, a decoy, but she'd dropped the real one while sneaking it back into her bag. Omar would be pleased. I stared at the signature line already filled in. Mirna Hargrove, written in a pen I didn't own with handwriting too smooth to be mine. My signature always slanted left. This one floated like it had never faced grief. I reached into the drawer, took out a matchbox, and walked into the garden. There, under the moonlight, I knelt by the fire pit Frank built the year before he died. The one Alexis said looked tacky with its mismatched stones. I struck a match, lit the corner of the paper, and watched the flames crawl up the lies. The fire danced in my glasses, reflected in the tears I didn't wipe away. "I haven't signed a damn thing," I whispered. The pages curled black and vanished into orange. The wind carried the ashes upward like an offering. She didn't know I'd seen her call after dinner. Didn't see me watching from the darkened study window as she paced next to her car phone pressed to her ear, her voice muffled by distance. But the porch camera caught it. Later, Omar extracted the audio, boosted it, cleaned the feed. Her voice unmistakable. "She's slipping." I saw her mix up the sugar with salt. Asked where the cats were while they sat right next to her. Pause. "No, she didn't sign, not yet. But she's close. The hesitation's shorter now, I can feel it." Pause. "Yes, prepare the full file. Transfer paperwork, medical affidavit, and send a courier to get the notary signature ready by Monday." Longer pause. "Because she'll fold. She's alone. No one visits her. And if she tries to fight it, we'll make sure the doctor backs it up. He's already been paid." I paused the recording, played it again, then again, until I knew every word by heart, until the betrayal stopped feeling new and started to calcify into something usable. Omar arrived early the next morning. I didn't ask how he slept. I didn't tell him I hadn't. I just placed the flash drive with the recording on the notebook. He listened in silence, eyes focused, mouth a tight line. Then he wrote, "It's enough to scare her." I wrote back, "It's not time for fear, it's time for mirrors." He understood, he always did. Alexis had played her hand. Now I would play mine. Not with screaming, not with pleas, but with silence sharpened into steel. I spent the day writing. A journal entry for each year Alexis was gone. Each moment she hadn't called, every holiday she'd missed, every birthday card that never came. Then I folded the pages, tied them with a blue ribbon, and placed them in a shoebox beneath my bed. It wasn't revenge, not yet. It was memory, proof, because if this game was going to end, it wouldn't end with one of us in a chair we couldn't leave or a room we couldn't unlock. It would end with truth, burning as bright as the papers she forged. There's a peculiar power in being underestimated. People look past you. They stop measuring your thoughts. Your intelligence becomes invisible, an empty room they no longer bother to enter. And once they think you're fading, they speak more freely. They loosen their grip on the lies. It's not a pleasant power, but it's effective. The plan to fake my unraveling didn't come to me in a sudden moment of inspiration. It emerged slowly, in the quiet hours between 2 a.m. and dawn, when the house was still and the walls remembered every voice that had once passed through them. I wrote it out in the notebook Omar and I had been using, not for him to see but for myself. A list, a blueprint, a script. 1. Forget small things. 2. Ask the same question twice. 3. Mix up names, use Frank instead of Omar. 4. Break something during the appointment. 5. Do not resist when Alexis helps. 6. Do not contradict her in front of witnesses. 7. Keep the mask on until it costs her too much to wear hers. The idea terrified me. I've spent my entire life clinging to clarity. A librarian remembers. A mother remembers. A widow remembers far too much. To pretend otherwise was like peeling off layers of myself and hiding them under the floorboards. But the stakes were clear. Alexis had already forged one set of documents. She'd already moved money I hadn't approved. If I didn't take control of the narrative, she would write the ending for me, and it would not be kind. The opportunity came a week later. Alexis insisted I schedule a medical checkup with Dr. Vance, someone she knew through her husband's company. A routine wellness visit, she called it. But the moment she sent over the appointment confirmation, I knew what it really was, an evaluation. Her email was too eager. The subject line read, "Just making sure you're okay, Mom." She never used emojis unless she was lying. Omar helped me prepare. He went through Dr. Vance's profile, found videos of her online. She specialized in cognitive assessments for older patients. Her clinic had recently installed video recording for transparency and patient safety. That was Alexis's way of creating evidence. She wanted a file, a film. I would give her one, but not the one she expected. The morning of the appointment, I wore my oldest coat, the one with the torn pocket and faded lining. I left my hair unbrushed, let it fall in uneven waves around my face. I picked mismatched socks on purpose, left one button undone on my cardigan. I looked like someone who couldn't quite keep hold of her edges anymore. When Alexis picked me up, she barely masked her satisfaction. "You look comfortable," she said, eyeing the coat. I smiled vaguely. I thought this was lunch. It's just a checkup, Mom. I nodded, blinked slowly. Checkup, right. In the car, I asked her what day it was twice. She didn't correct me the first time. The second time she did. It's Thursday. Oh, I said, pretending to be surprised. She smiled, glanced toward the windshield. You'll feel better after this. The clinic was a glass cube tucked between a florist and an insurance office. The waiting room smelled like lavender and hand sanitizer. A fish tank bubbled softly in the corner, the sound oddly hypnotic. I sat down carefully, looked at the receptionist, then leaned toward Alexis. Are we at the vet? I whispered. She chuckled. No, Mom. Oh, I thought I trailed off. The receptionist called my name. Dr. Vance was younger than I expected, maybe late 30s. Her voice had that deliberate calmness of someone who dealt with panic for a living. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, just a simple navy blouse, and the kind of shoes that made no sound on tile.
Mrs. Hargrove, how are we today?
I stared at her, let the pause stretch. Then I said Tuesday, right? She tilted her head slightly. It's Thursday. Oh, she smiled warmly. Let's begin. She walked me into a small room with 2 chairs and a round table. A camera perched high in the corner, its red light blinking. For the record, she said we're recording all wellness screenings now. I nodded. Good, so I can remember. The test was familiar. She asked me to list animals. I repeated dog 3 times. She asked me to draw a clock. I put all the numbers on the left side. When she asked me to name the current president, I said Reagan, and smiled softly like I wasn't sure if that was right. She kept her tone neutral. Can you tell me where you are? I looked around the room. I think I'm at the library. What town are we in? Boston, I guessed. She didn't correct me. She made notes. Halfway through the exam, she handed me a glass of water. I held it in my shaking hand, took a sip, and then, just as planned, let it slip from my grasp. The glass shattered on the floor. Oh, I whispered. I didn't mean... It's okay, she said quickly, standing. Accidents happen. I sat, frozen eyes wide, hands fluttering in my lap like helpless birds. I'm sorry, I said again. I get nervous. Everything slips lately. She nodded, reassuring. You're doing fine. When the test ended, she smiled and helped me back to the lobby. Alexis stood up, clearly watching through the one-way window during the entire session. She did great, Dr. Vance said, smiling with the same tone nurses use when explaining a fall to a child's parent. Alexis gripped my elbow gently. Let's get you home, Mom. On the ride back, I said nothing, just stared out the window, muttering occasionally under my breath. Not real words, just fragments. Names of long-gone neighbors. The phrase library finds 3 times. By the time we pulled into the driveway, Alexis looked at me like I was a problem already solved. As she walked me to the porch, she said, I'll be back tomorrow. We'll sign some things. Then you can rest. I looked up at her, eyes glassy. Do I get a sticker? She blinked. What? A sticker, I repeated softly. For being good. She patted my hand. You've been very good, Mom. Then she turned and walked back to her car, already dialing. From the living room through the cracked window, I heard her voice. She's ready, she said. Completely gone. Get the papers in order. We file this week. She got in the car, drove away. I walked back into the house, locked the door behind me, and laughed. Not because it was funny, not because I felt victorious, but because she believed me. She finally believed the lie, and now the real performance could begin. The screen flickered once, then glowed into life, soft blue light washing over the darkened walls of the living room like a quiet tide. Lines began to appear. Not roads, not maps, but trails, digital trails. Omar stood beside the projector, fingers twitching at his keyboard. His laptop was covered in soft foam tape to dampen the sound, and the cable snaked across the rug like a lifeline connecting him to the truth. I sat in my old armchair, wrapped in a quilt, my heart drumming to the rhythm of something too old for excitement and too deep for fear. This is the flow of her phone data, he said quietly. Locations, pings, towers. A dotted line bloomed across the map of the city. A pattern repeated visits to the same address on alternating Fridays at 4:12 p.m. Omar clicked again. The address expanded into a name, Harbor Pines Retirement and Wellness Facility. Next, overlay a second map. Bank transaction records cross-checked with timestamps from her emails. It's not just visits, Omar murmured. She moves money every time. He highlighted a series of dates. Each one matched a visit. each one followed by an outgoing wire transfer in small, well-timed batches, $2,300 here, $4,750 there, spread thin enough to avoid bank red flags, all masked as care-related expenses. A third overlay now lit the wall. It was an email chain. Omar had managed to trace and reconstruct metadata from Alexis's email drafts, even the ones deleted too quickly to send. He was fast, thorough, and relentless. Like a wire through silence, he had tunneled into every shadow she left behind. The emails weren't even clever. They were crude, arrogant, designed under the assumption that no one was watching. Subject: Final POA Document Draft 5. Once we get the last signature, we move forward with the transfer. Harbor Pines has cleared the intake so long as the medical affidavit is notarized. Also reminder to call Vance Recapacity Review Edit. Needs to be stronger. And this one, I'll bring the original to Mom myself. She's basically gone. We're staging the confusion episode on the porch recording via ring cam. She won't remember it. She didn't even recognize her own birthday card last week. The next slide appeared an image. A security camera still from outside Harbor Pines. Alexis stepping out of her car, holding a folder, shaking hands with a man whose face was pixelated, but whose badge was unmistakably that of the facility director, Leonard Hall. The next image, the same man, same location, 1 week later. This time accompanied by a third individual, someone Omar identified as an attorney known for elder conservatorship filings. Alexis had built her own tribunal. A system of validation designed to look official but wired to serve one thing only: control. I leaned forward in my chair. Omar clicked again. A digital model unfolded his masterpiece, a 3D interactive timeline. At the top, the months since my accident. Along the side categories, money flow location, witness contact, legal drafts. Each node, when clicked, bloomed into its own universe, an email here, a call log there, a time-stamped Ring doorbell clip. It wasn't just evidence. It was narrative, proof that Alexis hadn't reacted to an ailing mother, she had orchestrated one. The room was silent except for the low hum of the projector fan. Omar stood back from the screen. His chest was rising and falling rapidly, not from nerves but from something else. Maybe the closeness of vindication. Maybe the weight of seeing the story laid bare. He turned to me. I said nothing. Instead, I stood slowly and walked up to the wall. I pointed at one node, the first red dot on the money trail. That was before the hospital, I said. Omar nodded. She started building this before the crash. I looked at the screen. The names, the dates, the signatures, the altered prescriptions, the conveniently chosen doctor. The media interview Leonard Hall gave 6 months ago, where he dismissed all allegations of elder exploitation. I whispered. She was preparing for me to fail. Omar tilted his head. I turned to him. But I didn't. He smiled slightly. I stepped back and let the full map fill my view. She saw my independence as a threat, I said, and she responded with a campaign. Omar typed something, turned the map red, highlighting all known accomplices, all IP addresses that were confirmed. It was like watching a network of infection light up. Cháu vừa về lại bản đồ của một vụ phản bội, I murmured. He stopped typing, looked up. The words hung there in the low light, heavier than anything we'd spoken before. This wasn't just betrayal. It was a blueprint, planned, executed, hidden in plain sight. I felt my hands tighten around the edge of the quilt. What do we do with this? I asked. Omar stared at the screen for a long time. Then he wrote slowly on his pad. We give it a witness. He turned the laptop toward me. Opened a new folder, inside a digital compilation, labeled meticulously, Financial Trail, Primary, Medical Collusion, Dr. V, Email Chain, Unauthorized Drafts, Harbor Pines Linked Surveillance, Mirna, Incident Recording Staged, Projected Impact Timeline, if left unchallenged. He looked at me, pen hovering. I nodded. Build it like a case. He wrote, like a trial presentation. I smiled. No, like a story. He paused, then typed into the folder, Story of the Unbroken Woman. We worked through the night. I dictated. He built. I recounted timelines. He verified them. I gave context to names. He layered the files. By sunrise, we had something that felt like a heartbeat in code. It was evidence, yes, but it was also emotion, memory, identity. It wasn't about punishing Alexis. Not entirely. It was about restoring the ground under my feet. And if I could help it under the feet of others who'd been stripped of their voice simply because they had silver in their hair. Omar handed me a flash drive. It was silver smooth, warm from use. Do I carry it? I asked. He nodded. I closed my hand around it. It felt heavier than its weight. Not a weapon, not a shield, but a key. And now the door was ready to be opened. There's a difference between reading about something cruel and standing inside it. Reading gives you a filter, a page, a pause button. But when you walk into the hallways of Harbor Pines at midnight and the air smells like bleached silence and old regret, there's no filter left. Only eyes, watching. Omar and I stood in the side corridor behind the kitchen loading dock, cloaked in shadows. He held a small black device the size of a wallet, custom-built, lined with copper shielding designed to ping the building's internal camera grid every 3 seconds with a false loop of still frames. 15 minutes, he whispered. That's all I can give us. Then let's find what she didn't want seen, I replied. He nodded. We moved in. The hallways of Harbor Pines looked freshly painted, but you could see the age in the corners. Too many layers of whitewash, too many layers of silence. I walked slowly, but not like someone sneaking. I walked like someone expected to be there. My gait had the ghost of authority, decades of library steps, discipline, and silence. We passed a common room, lights dimmed. One elderly woman sat alone in a wheelchair facing a turned-off television. Her eyes didn't move. Her lips parted like she'd just been about to speak and then forgotten how. Further down, Omar stopped at a junction and tapped his tablet. The screen showed camera nodes with soft red pulses. Most were in sleep cycle surveillance mode, but a few flickered strangely. Some feeds looped longer than others, he muttered. They're manipulating them from inside, too. They're not just hiding us, I said. They've been hiding others. We turned the corner and came to a locked door labeled Memory Unit, restricted access. Omar bypassed the lock in seconds. He had installed a patch that mimicked staff keycard frequency using a low-level RF duplicator. The door clicked. Inside, the air was warmer, heavier. You could smell medication and lemon cleanser. The hallway branched into 6 private rooms, each with partially open doors. We moved to the third. A man sat inside, old but alert, his skin pale under yellow lamplight. His bed was spotless. No photographs, no personal items, just a drawer labeled Property on Hold. He turned slowly as we entered. His voice was dry but sharp. You're not nurses. No, I whispered. We're here to listen. He squinted. They said I got confused, that I signed something. But I didn't. I never signed anything. Who told you that? My daughter, he said bitterly. She said it was just to help with the mail. Next thing I know, I'm here. I can't even vote anymore. My throat tightened. What's your name? Eugene. I knelt beside him. Eugene, you're not alone. He nodded slowly. I knew I wasn't crazy. I remember everything. They want to make you forget what you know. Omar was already recording quietly, his device tuned to catch only voice and timestamp, no faces. We moved to the next room. A woman in her late 80s sat curled up on the bed, humming a song that no longer had words. On her nightstand, a letter torn stamped but never mailed. It was addressed to someone in Georgia. The handwriting shook with age and something else, urgency. She tried to send it out, I whispered, lifting the envelope, but someone stopped her. Omar took a photo. We kept going, room by room. Testimonies, fragments, half-sentences, some coherent, some shattered, all pointing to the same truth. People had been brought here without full consent, stripped of their independence, disconnected from family, not complicit in the arrangement. Their homes were sold pensions, redirected assets liquidated in their best interest. But nothing about this place felt like interest, only control. Omar's tablet buzzed. They noticed, he said. System scan just spiked. We've got 2 minutes. A voice echoed behind us, firm male, too confident for this hour. Who's there? We froze. Down the hall, a guard stepped into view. He was tall, heavy-set flashlight already sweeping the corridor. I grabbed Omar's hand. This way. We ducked through a staff access corridor barely illuminated. Omar reached into his bag, pulled a small EMP burst tool, and clicked it toward the junction box near the floor. The hallway went dark for 2 seconds. Just enough. We moved fast. Voices called out behind us, more than one now. North wing offline, I repeat, north wing, get visual. We turned left back through the common room. The woman in the wheelchair was gone. An aide stood nearby, looking confused, holding a folder. Go, I whispered. Back at the service entrance, Omar slammed the unlock protocol. The bolt clicked. We tumbled into the cold air breath fogging in the night. The parking lot was quiet. Our car was parked 2 blocks away. We sprinted toward the shadows. Behind us, the building hummed back to life. Inside, they might not know who we were, but they'd know someone saw. We didn't speak until we were back in my living room. I made tea with shaking hands. Omar downloaded the voice files. They were clear, sharper than I'd hoped. I'll clean up the background, he said. Remove echoes. Isolate voice signatures. What about the letter I asked? Traced, he said, nodding. The woman who wrote it, she's a retired school principal. Her niece in Georgia filed a missing person report 2 years ago. No record of response. I felt my stomach twist. She's been buried in paperwork, I whispered. Not just her body, her identity. Omar opened a new folder. Named it Witnesses. 5 files went in. We send this to the court, he asked. Not yet. I looked out the window. Not until we make them hear it. He nodded. Then we go public first. The next morning we sent a package. Unmarked envelope. USB drive. Handwritten note that read, "These voices are real, and they remember." The envelope went to a local journalist, then another, then a third. We posted a teaser on a secure blog. It simply said, "When power becomes silence, the survivors must scream." Alexis wouldn't see it coming. She thought I was fading. But the truth, I was just getting louder. The courtroom was cold, not in temperature, but in tone, in posture, in the way the bailiff never made eye contact. And the chairs seemed just a little too far apart to allow anyone to feel human. Mirna sat in the second row, her gray coat neatly buttoned, her cane resting across her knees. Her eyes stared into nothingness, blank, still, and calculated. Alexis stood across the aisle, crisp in a navy dress suit, her expression carefully sculpted somewhere between concern and fatigue. To her left, her lawyer Leonard Swain, tall, composed, well-paid. He kept his hands folded neatly on the oak table, a silver watch peeking from under his cuff. The man smelled like airtight affidavits and a decade of silence won by signatures. Docket number 1529, the clerk began. In the matter of Alexis Hargrove versus Mirna Hargrove, petition for full conservatorship and medical guardianship under Elder Protection Code 3.5. The judge, a woman in her 50s with eyes that didn't blink, often looked up. Is Miss Hargrove present? Mirna didn't answer. The bailiff leaned slightly toward her. She blinked slowly. Alexis took a small performative breath. Your Honor, she said, soft but firm. My mother suffered a head injury 6 weeks ago. Since then, her mental state has declined. I'm only here to make sure she's safe. Her lawyer stood. He tapped a folder. This, Your Honor, is an affidavit from Dr. Leonard Vance, specialist in geriatric cognition, stating the respondent has exhibited signs of disassociation, short-term memory disruption, and paranoid ideation. The judge reviewed the document. Does Miss Hargrove have representation? Alexis's lawyer interjected. She has refused counsel and shows no capacity to choose one. Silence, then a quiet creak. Mirna shifted. Her hand moved slowly to the floor, picked up her cane, pressed down, and stood. She didn't look shaky. She didn't look lost. She looked precise. I do not refuse counsel, she said clearly. The judge blinked. Excuse me, I refuse this farce. A murmur rustled the back rows. Alexis's face stiffened. I may be 74, Mirna said, walking slowly forward, but my mind isn't 70. It isn't fragile, and it isn't yours to steal. Objection, Alexis's lawyer snapped. She is unrepresented, and I will represent myself, Mirna said. The judge raised a hand. Sit down, Mr. Swain. The courtroom held its breath. Mirna reached into her bag, removed a silver USB. I'd like to submit evidence. It includes voice recordings, financial data, video surveillance, and metadata timelines. All compiled by a young man who has not said more than 10 words to me aloud, but who has listened to more truth than any of you. The judge hesitated. Are you saying you've been surveilled? I'm saying Mirna said I've been protected. She turned. Omar, please. From the 4th row, a young man in a gray hoodie and black shoes stood up. He walked forward, careful hands steady. He placed a second USB stick onto the tech table. The clerk plugged it in. The courtroom screen turned black. Then data bloomed like fire. A timeline, color-coded, dated, sourced. January 6th, Mirna said. First unauthorized financial access. The screen pulsed $2,320s withdrawn. Location remote IP. January 10th. Meeting between my daughter and the director of Harbor Pines. The screen showed a security photo. Alexis shaking hands. Murmurs. January 21st. Alteration of prescription medication under my name. A faxed document with forged initials appeared, side by side with the verified original from the pharmacy. The judge leaned forward. Your Honor. Alexis's lawyer said this is clearly a fabrication. No. Mirna snapped. This is a fabrication. She pointed to the affidavit. This which you had someone write without ever visiting me. This petition filed under the guise of love to obtain my house, my pension, my name. The screen now played voices. First Eugene's. I never signed anything. My daughter did it all. Then a woman's voice, strained but firm. They say I forget too much, but I remember every book I taught, every name of my students. Then Mirna's voice clipped from an earlier recording. She thinks she can erase me. But I was keeping records before she was born. Alexis rose. Your Honor, this is revenge. Mirna turned. No, this is restoration. The judge tapped her gavel once. Silence. The video cut to a visual map of IP traces, emails, calls, payments, all layered, all leading back to Alexis's bank account. The judge stared at the screen. How long have you been gathering this? Mirna smiled. Since I realized I was never confused, only underestimated. The courtroom was silent again. Omar walked back to his seat, head down, but his steps were lighter. The judge leaned back. Well, she said slowly, it appears we are not in the presence of diminished capacity. She turned to Alexis. But we may be in the presence of intent to defraud. Gasps. Alexis stepped back. No, she's playing you. She's been doing this for months. Because I had to, Mirna said. Alexis looked like someone who had lost control of a car and was still pretending she was driving. The judge lifted her gavel again. This hearing is no longer about conservatorship. It is now a referral to the district court for possible criminal inquiry. Ms. Hargrove, you are free to go. Ms. Alexis Hargrove remained seated. Bang! The gavel hit, and with it a door closed. Not on age, not on family, but on lies. Mirna turned, looked straight at Omar. He blinked once, then smiled. Just a little. Just enough. The courtroom settled into a breathless hush as Omar stepped forward. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. He approached the witness stand with the quiet grace of someone used to being overlooked. In his hands was a small black remote. The courtroom technician nodded. The judge gestured silently. The lights dimmed, and then the walls lit up. A glowing animated data map burst across the screen. Nodes pulsed in red, blue, and orange. Arcs of movement danced between bank institutions, IP locations, private messages. Mirna's financial timeline. A second node, Alexis's account. Then a third, Harbor Pines. The web connected them all like a nervous system of betrayal. Gasps from the gallery. Mirna didn't look away. Omar pressed another button. A zoom-in showed the initial transfer, January 6th, to $320, followed by a second, January 15th, flagged by the bank's algorithm but overridden manually by a staff member with access. Then a fourth screen split into 4 segments. Surveillance footage of Alexis at a notary office. A digital voice message. You get the signatures, I'll prepare the room. A scanned power of attorney signed time-stamped but never notarized. A security log from Harbor Pines showing an elderly resident transferred 2 days before her legal documents were processed. The room vibrated with tension. Omar stood still. He did not look at anyone, but everyone looked at him. The judge slowly leaned forward. Is this verified? Mirna answered for him. Each frame, timestamp, and entry log has been cross-checked by 3 independent systems. Omar clicked one final slide. This time it wasn't data. It was a photo. An elderly woman, eyes wide, hands pressed against a glass window inside Harbor Pines. A handwritten note taped to the glass. My daughter doesn't visit. I never wanted this. There were no sounds in the courtroom now, not even breathing. Leonard Swain, Alexis's lawyer, slowly stood. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, I withdraw from representation. The judge nodded gravely. So noted. Alexis stood up like a woman underwater, her voice cracked high and shaking. All of this, over a house, over some money. She left me. She left me. When I was 12, she put me in that school and never looked back. She chose silence over me. You think she's a hero. She's a ghost in that house, a cold, bitter woman who shut every door on me, and now she gets to play victim. Tears now, but no longer persuasive, no longer curated, just unraveling. You want to know the truth, Alexis screamed. I'm not stealing anything. I'm taking back what I was owed. That house, that pension, that peace of mind. I was supposed to have it because she never gave me anything else. The bailiff stepped forward. The judge's voice cut through like ice. Ms. Hargrove, you will sit down or be removed. Alexis froze. She looked at Mirna expecting something. A reaction, a flinch, a crack in the ice. But Mirna just stared at her. Like someone looking into a room she had once lived in but never called home. You always knew the words that could hurt me, Mirna said softly. But you never once tried to understand the ones I couldn't say. Omar looked up, and for the first time in the entire ordeal he made eye contact. With Mirna, it was like two people nodding across an invisible bridge. The judge turned to the clerk. Prepare a summary for referral to criminal court. Petitioner is now under investigation for fraud, elder abuse, and attempted unlawful conservatorship. The gavel didn't just fall, it echoed. And in that echo, truth had finally become louder than silence. The gavel's echo had barely faded when the courtroom door clicked shut behind Alexis Hargrove. Her trial moved quickly. 3 weeks later, the same courtroom sat packed once again. News vans cluttered the courthouse steps. Inside, Mirna sat alone, hair pinned neatly, a navy shawl over her shoulders like armor. She didn't glance back. She didn't need to. Alexis entered in handcuffs, flanked by 2 officers. She looked smaller now. Less fury, more fatigue. Her eyes scanned the courtroom and stopped briefly on Omar. He didn't blink. The prosecution opened with evidence already made public: financial records, the fake power of attorney video proof of her interactions with Harbor Pines executives, and witness statements from 3 other elderly victims recovered from the facility. A judge read aloud the verdict. Alexis Hargrove, this court finds you guilty of elder financial abuse, attempted fraudulent conservatorship, and conspiracy to detain vulnerable adults for monetary gain. You are hereby sentenced to 7 years in state custody. A murmur ran through the gallery. Alexis closed her eyes. Just once, no tears. The judge turned to Mirna. Ms. Hargrove, do you have anything to say to this court? Mirna stood slowly. She approached the microphone, her shoes quiet on the polished wood. No justice can undo betrayal, she began, voice steady. But justice, when it works, reminds us that we are not invisible, that dignity doesn't expire with age. She turned to the public gallery. We need to listen when the quiet ones speak, because some of us have waited a lifetime to be heard. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, quickly silenced by a gavel. Later that day, news broke that Harbor Pines had been issued a federal injunction. The facility was ordered shut pending investigation. A week after the sentencing, Omar was invited to speak at a public town hall hosted at the local library. He arrived early, wearing the same navy blue shirt he always wore when something mattered. Mirna sat in the front row. The mayor introduced him as a citizen whose silence changed the course of justice. Omar walked to the podium. The room waited. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small keyboard. He typed slowly, then pressed a button. On the screen behind him, a line of text appeared. I'm not good at talking, but someone had to say something. The room was still. Then applause, deep, rising, lasting. Afterward, Mirna placed a hand on Omar's shoulder. He looked at her, then down at his shoes. You did, she said, and it mattered. That same week, the Office for Elder Affairs issued new guidelines on legal conservatorship proceedings, citing the Hargrove case as precedent. Mirna returned to her home, but not alone. A group of volunteers, social workers, and former residents of Harbor Pines helped turn her house into something new. A warm light glowed from the front porch now, where a brass plaque read, "The Quiet House, a refuge for the unheard." Inside, Omar had his own small corner, with a monitor cables and wires running like vines. He helped set up secure portals for whistleblowers. Mirna watched over meals, medication, and story-sharing circles. Once a young woman asked her, "What made you fight back?" Mirna smiled. "Because no one expected me to." She looked over her shoulder where Omar was typing something. On her way out of the room, she paused at the old bookshelf, running her fingers along the worn spines. Then she whispered, "Some chapters are written louder than others." And for the first time in a long while, she felt heard. The sun cut through the lace curtains of the living room, spilling gold across the hardwood floor of the house that had once been a battleground. But now the war was over. Mirna stood at the kitchen window, a steaming mug of mint tea cupped in both hands. Her eyes followed the delicate curve of the morning light outside, where 3 elderly residents tended to a small garden plot. One gently patted down soil around a tomato plant. Another arranged marigolds along the fence. A third stood beside a young apricot tree, breathing deeply as if the roots grounded her too. They weren't just growing vegetables. They were reclaiming ground bit by bit for trust, for joy, for autonomy. The brass plaque outside read, "Safe Stop, a home for the unheard." It wasn't loud, it wasn't big, but it was real. Mirna had funded it with what remained of her savings and a small grant from the city awarded after her case made national news. But what made it live was not money, it was presence. Inside, Omar sat at his usual station. Screens blinked softly in front of him. One monitored bank alerts for sudden withdrawals from elder accounts flagged by his custom code. Another watched over encrypted messages from whistleblowers, caregivers, nurses, even estranged family members, quiet voices who needed somewhere to speak. A third screen showed the front porch where a newly arrived guest sat, suitcase on her lap, unsure if she should knock. Omar typed. A small welcome message popped up on the porch intercom. "You are safe, you are home, please come in." She did. Mirna turned from the window and walked to the front door, opening it just as the woman stepped in. "I heard about what you did," the woman whispered, her voice trembling. Mirna reached out not to shake hands, but to guide her by the arm. "Let's get you some tea," she said. Upstairs, the communal room had been transformed. The dusty furniture had been replaced by plush seats and lamps that offered soft light. On the wall was a large corkboard covered in index cards. Each card bore a message written by a resident. "I matter. She didn't win. I got my voice back. No one gets to decide my last chapter but me." Omar passed through quietly, tacking up a new card in his section of the board. It read, "Some systems are silent by design. I'm not anymore." In the garden, the breeze picked up. The marigolds swayed. A chime on the porch played a soft 3-note melody. Mirna walked outside and joined the 3 residents. She stooped down beside them, her knees stiff but her hands steady. One of them smiled without looking up. "I used to be a teacher," she said. "Now I'm learning how to breathe again." "Then you're doing just fine," Mirna said. From the corner of the house, Omar appeared, not on the screen, not behind a keyboard, but in person. He walked slowly, hesitantly, until he stood beneath the apricot tree. One of the residents waved at him, and for the first time Omar smiled, just a small curve of the lips, but it held years. Mirna saw it. She blinked back the tears, but one escaped. She didn't wipe it away. Later that evening, the house was quiet. The kind of quiet that didn't threaten but comforted, the kind that old libraries knew, the kind that whispered, "You've made it through." Mirna stood on the back porch. Lights shimmered gently from the kitchen. Inside, Omar was showing a new guest how to use the smart lock on her bedroom door. In her hand, Mirna held a notebook. She opened it to a blank page and wrote, "This house was built with what was almost stolen from me, trust." She paused, then added, "And it will stand as long as someone believes in silence that leads to truth." She looked up. The stars were out. Not many, but enough. Behind her, the old door creaked open. "Miss Mirna," it was one of the residents, "we saved you a seat for story night." She smiled. "Lead the way." Fade to black. End credits roll over, quiet laughter, soft music, and still frames. Omar adjusting a projector for a movie night. Mirna placing fresh flowers beside the plaque. A group photo on the porch, every smile hard won, every hand held. Final frame, Omar's computer screen, one blinking message waiting to be opened. Text reads, "Are you still listening? I hope so. I think I need help." He clicks it. A small blue window pops open. He begins to type.